Howdy, folks. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am your host, the Mighty Bjorn, and today for you, got a tabletop gaming video. I'm going to be focusing on some Tiny D6 stuff because today the primary focus is going to be discussing some stuff with Tiny Gunslingers. Now, what I'm going to be primarily focused on is actually discussing creating bounties. And I think this is actually a pretty good subject to discuss because, well, mm, I made a guide that kind of helps you create bounties, but this is kind of one of those Western genre. How do I want to put it? It's kind of a mainstay, if you will, the whole idea of bounties, especially because of spaghetti westerns. It was a common theme in spaghetti westerns that the main character, the protagonist, was a bounty hunter. And it actually, that just so happens to also work out pretty well for Tiny Gunslingers, as Alan's goal essentially with Tiny Gunslingers was to kind of give a more spaghetti western feel as a western tabletop RPG. And well, as I said, bounty hunting was a mainstay in spaghetti westerns. But there's also plenty of historic evidence of bounty hunters, bounty posters, etc. um, these are some examples I found online. I don't know how authentic they actually are, but I am well aware of actually real bounties existing. And you can see there's this one here. This one is actually for the Sundance Kid. And then this one here is for Jesse James. This was actually a bounty that was posted by the railroad. It was actually not posted by a law enforcement agency, although more often than not, they would be posted by law enforcement agencies. However, it was quite common for stagecoach companies, the railroad, etc., to also post bounty posters as well, uh, just because the law would take its time sometimes, and they kind of wanted these people now, so they would actually post bounties as well. Now, with all that being said, bounty hunting at the time was a very lucrative, but also a very dangerous business. So, this is actually a great way for your characters, player characters, to make money if they want to be bounty hunters. Now, when it comes to creating the bounty itself, it's really not too far removed from a previous video I did where I discussed about making a big bad evil guy. And essentially, if you've watched any tutorial on making big bad evil guys, or if you have your own method of creating the big bad evil guy, then that's pretty much what you're doing here, except for you're also adding a few additional steps. So we'll dive into it. We'll get it quick because, like I said, a lot of this is going to be familiar, and there's other tutorials out there that you can watch to kind of glean this information, if you will, including there's one on my channel. So the first place to really start would be a name. I would also add an alias just because an alias, I don't know, it sounds cool, especially on the maybe not so much on the lower end bounties, but on like the really higher end bounties where you're starting to get $10,000 rewards and $20,000 rewards, so on and so forth. Then you might want to take and also have an alias because that was actually quite common in the Old West. I mean, you had Billy the Kid and the Sundance Kid, and the list just goes on and on of all the different aliases out there that people have gotten over the years, especially during the periods in the period of the Old West. Of course, you're going to want to have at least a short background written up. That way, when you're designing the character, if you have a short background written up, you can also gear their equipment and their skills towards what their background is and maybe even what made them turn to crime in the first place. So I would say probably a paragraph, maybe two, should be more than enough realistically for a background. And also that should also help you judge the skills. As well as you should have a description. Now, one thing I will say with the description is just as a piece of advice is also have some kind of identifying feature or mark. Uh, maybe, I don't know, some kind of tattoo or a scar or a missing finger, anything along those lines. Just that's just my bit of advice, if you will. You don't necessarily have to do that. The next thing is also their personal belongings. You're going to want that stuff because, of course, a part of their personal belongings is going to be guns. They may have a horse. More than likely, they will have a horse. Um, Things of that nature. Things that they're going to have that they're going to use to fight back, essentially. Because, of course, if these are criminals that are on the run, yeah, they don't want to be captured. So they're going to fight tooth and nail to not be captured. And if they are captured, they're going to do anything and everything they can to get away from their captor. Now here's where it you kind of expand a bit because it's because of it being a bounty is what is their crime. You should sit down and figure out what their crime or crimes are. And in my in my book, I covered a very basic series or common series of crimes that bounties would be placed for. But with that said, it doesn't cover everything. You can always come up with something, and then when you're doing the crimes and you're coming up, you're going to use the crimes to create the reward, and the rewards are going to stack based on what crimes they commit, and also, um, pretty much things of that nature. And when it comes to there's various different types of theft I have outlined there. Essentially, you should just combine all the theft together, or you could have them separated. But essentially, when it comes to the reward, you're going to want to total the reward together based on what crimes they committed and what is the damages of said crimes, and particularly when it comes to things like theft. Or I also outlined medical malpractice because that's actually something too that a bounty could be placed for, especially if a patient dies. Now, I am kind of hinting all this stuff. I've been keep bringing up this book. So, America the Beautiful is available on Drive Thru RPG. This is just a quick plug in. I really don't feel like I need to actually plug this, but I'm just mentioning it because I do keep bringing it up. And it's just a guideline to help you as a game master to maybe kind of help create your own bounties. If you got your own methods, more power to you. Use your own methods. It's just something I'm throwing out there because one thing I do outline is different types of theft. Pretty much everything in there's basically ranges from petty theft all the way up to grand theft, which would be you might want to write it differently on the wanted poster or when you're writing up the bounty. You might say it was a train robbery because that would be probably more along the lines of grand theft because that's where more than likely they're getting out with a few hundred or well several hundred or even a few $1,000. um, and train robbery was actually quite common in the old west, so was stagecoach robbery and bank robbery. And then of course I actually have horse theft as a completely separate bounty in itself. And there's a couple reasons why horse theft. One reason is it horse theft legally during the days of the Old West. And actually, there's my understanding is there's still some states that it's written this way that horse theft was punishable by death. So actually, it's one of the lower end bounties, if you will, that would convert your bounty from wanted alive to wanted dead or alive. Um, and actually, horse theft at that time period was quite serious. We might snicker at that now because a horse a horse at that time period was a livelihood. You're there's a lot of land that is barren. There's uh, you might be several 100 miles from the nearest town or whatever. So Yeah, a horse having a horse could be life or death in the days of the old west. We don't really think about that now because cars, uh, but that is on there. And also, basically, I kind of gave kind of like a guideline of what changes a bounty from wanted alive to wanted dead or alive. One of those would be murder, because essentially at that point, the bounty would be considered too dangerous to want to take in, or there's enough proof to essentially hang them as it is. Uh, but there's also penalties for bringing in a bounty dead. And that's because, of course, the justice system wants to feel like they're doing their job. So they want to do a show trial in the whole 9 yards, and they want to publicly execute them, that type of thing. So that's something to kind of think about with your bounties as you're creating your bounty posters for your tiny gunslingers. As well as I also put some stuff in there for the gains. Gains would actually, well, accessories and gains, if you will, they may have their own individual bounties based on what crimes they've actually committed, but more than likely they would just be kind of grouped up in an association. So we'll just say Billy the Kid is worth $10,000, and if you rein in his posse, it's an additional $1,200 or something along those lines. It's normally how something like that would be done, but you could also have individual bounties for the gain as well. Um, a great example is if you've seen 310 to Yuma, Ben Wade was the mastermind of the gain, but then Charlie Prince was the number two. In that scenario, I would be me personally as a game master if I want to say make Ben Wade's gain. I would be I would set a bounty for Ben Wade, but then I could also take a few moments and set an individual bounty for just Charlie Prince because, well, Charlie Prince was the vicious Mad Dog killer type, although they both kind of were, but uh, we won't get too deep into that one because that's kind of like the analysis of a bad guy, and I don't want to get into that right now. Now, the next thing I want to bring up with bounties too is it is quite possible, and there's historic evidence of this as well, for someone to have a bounty, say in Colorado, but not be wanted in California. So bounties kind of had issues with state lines, and that's because the country really wasn't completely unified yet. There were still certain areas such as Colorado. Most of the West was actually territories. So not even it's some based on what time period you decide that your tiny gunslinger setting is in. Some states may not even be states; it might only be territories, which can cause issues in itself. And that's kind of where also bounty hunters come into play because while the law had certain rules and regulations about where lawmen could and couldn't go, bounty hunters didn't really have to worry about that. Now, with that being said, you also got federal marshals in there, which really didn't care about state lines either, and even Texas Rangers, if you will. From my understanding, there was times where Texas Rangers actually operated in Mexico. So there's some gray area there that you can kind of play with when it comes to doing your Tiny Gunslingers campaign. But it is something that should be thought about is state lines because, like I said, someone wanted in Colorado might not be wanted in California. And that's actually what a lot of criminals would do is they would actually cross various territory and state lines to get away from the law. So they may be wanted in one state and not in another, and they would just kind of lay low in another state. Normally, it would be a neighboring state. So if, say, and this is just something to kind of think about when doing your campaign and doing your adventure for your bounty hunters, is that if your bounty is wanted in Texas, they may lie low in, say, Arizona or New Mexico or another neighboring state, and they just constantly keep committing crimes in Texas. Actually, I think that was the idea with Ben Wade. Ben Wade's gain from 310 to Yuma is that they were committing crimes in Texas, and then they were crossing the border into Mexico to lay low, and then they were recrossing the border to commit more crimes, rob trains, stagecoaches, whatever. But anyway, folks, I am going to wrap up today's video at that. Hopefully, you all enjoyed it. Thank you very much for tuning in, and have yourself a wonderful day.